Ken?
Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Thane Rover Crew, a crew independent of any other body, I would like to welcome you to this talk on the history of Rover Scouting. It is really grand to see such interest, and if there is anybody in the audience who would like to find out more about rovering with a view to becoming a rover, please contact us afterwards, as we will be able to help and put you in touch with the nearest crew or become a member of the Thanes. Colin Walker is one of the 3 founder members of the Thane Rover Crew and is our scribe. He has written 12 books on Scout history and gives numerous talks across the world. There is nobody better to give this talk. You can write your questions using the chat function, and then, depending on time, there will be an opportunity for your discussion. And so, with no more ado, over to Colin.
Well, good evening, everybody. Isn't this a bit like old times? Isn't this a bit like our talks at Gilwell? And who can remember how we started our talks at Gilwell? We always had a pretend prize for those that have come the furthest. And some of you have been putting messages on the screen as you enter the room to tell us where you come from. And I think the winner is from Australia. We've got close contenders from South America, but the winner is from Australia. Well, welcome, everybody. We're going to take you on a whirlwind tour, not just celebrating 100 years of Rover Scouting as we did in 2018, but like all scouting stories, we have to start back at the very beginning. So we're going to move on from 1907 right up to the present day. So we better get motoring. Okay, so in 1907, we'll take you back to Baden-Powell writing his seminal book, Scouting for Boys. The title gives the game away. He didn't think about scouting for men, did he? He did mention in Scouting for Boys that he was interested in growing men, but that was enough. He got enough on. You can hardly blame him, but he didn't spare any thought in 1907 for what he was going to do with what became called the older boy. So Scouting, as we know, started January the 1st, 1908. And by 1912, 4 years later, some of the boys that had joined Scouts age 12, well, they were 16. 16-year-olds in 1908 are not like 16-year-olds now because they'd have been working for 2 years. Some of them would have been in apprenticeship. Some of them would have been in other sorts of jobs where they were with men and in many cases acting like men. And naturally, scouting was for boys. So for the first time, we encountered this expression in leakage, this expression in scouting that was to live right up to my days in the 50s, 60s, and I've heard it at county meetings quite frequently, right up to the present day. And that word is leakage. What shall we do to retain the older boy? So there was 1 or 2 thoughts given to that. And one particular scheme was revolutionary. It was devised by a Mr. Bartley in conjunction with Baden-Powell because the government of the day said that all working people had to belong to a friendly society. So Mr. Bartlett persuaded Baden-Powell that he should form the Scouts Friendly Society. Now, the idea was that everybody paid their dues to the Friendly Society. All working people had to belong to one. And then in times of bad times, if they should fall ill, they could get a dole from the Friendly Society. Now, this was a very good wheeze, wasn't it? Because Scouts were on their honor to be trusted. So they're not going to malinger. They're not going to malinger, are they? So as well as that, they're not going to tell lies. So they had to belong to a friendly society. They're not losing anything. Why not belong to the Scout Friendly Society? And the Scout Friendly Society fills 2 aims with 1 stone, and that is it retains the older boy that's working, and the other end, which is very nice, it receives some income from running the Friendly Society. So that was a really, really good scheme, and it did persist right up into the 60s. But however, there was a big cloud on the horizon that rather put the kibosh on it for 4 or 5 years, called the First World War. And in it, as we know from our studies of Brownsea and Matlock, exactly the mathematical fraction of 1/3 of the boys who went to Brownsea and 1/3 of the boys who went to Humshoff in Northumberland died on the Somme, 1914, 15, and 16. And so these young men that went to war, all volunteers, grew old very, very quickly. As the war went on, it became obvious that when they returned, if they returned, the world would be a different place. So at a scouting conference in Matlock in 1917, BP was thinking about what needed to be done when the war ended. And he said at that conference, what is wanted is a definite attraction and status for the senior boy. And by consultation with the others present, they devised a scheme. And the scheme was called Senior Scouts. So senior scouts would have a different uniform. They couldn't wear shorts anymore. They'd got to wear jumpers, and they had a badge. And here is the lapel badge with SS standing for Senior Scouts in 1917. And they also had epaulets to wear on their shirts. And the epaulets also with a silver SS on a maroon background. And on their hat, they wore a hat band that you can see at the top of the image there, says SS, and that went on the top of their hat. Now, this scheme that had been designed called Senior Scouts, but it was very much about preparing the older boy for work. And so it was a bit like the Workers' Educational Association. There were night classes to attend, correspondence courses to answer, and a lot of learning to be done, which was no doubt admirable for preparing young men for the world of work and helping them to get better jobs. But in the real world, these young men were up to their neck in muck and bullets on the Somme, seeing and doing things that no young man should ever have to see. And they were going to return, and they're not going to be interested in night school. So there was a lone voice at the conference the following year, Easter the following year. That was a Mr. Benson, and he was a lone voice, and he said, these young men that are coming back are going to be old before their time. They are not boys anymore. We have to do something special for them. And at the conference, that fell on deaf ears. But Baden-Powell was a listener, and he took on board that message. And the first time anybody ever heard the word rover was in August 1918 in the Headquarters Gazette magazine, where BP wrote, our pamphlet on Senior Scouts, or Rovers as they wish to be called, is in the press, and I hope it will be useful to scoutmasters and older boys. We've still got that word boys. And they then, this new section to the scout movement, the colour of the epaulets changed, and you can see them there, top right-hand corner, with the word Rovers. So there's a bit of, if you read scout history books, you'll find out that it will say that Baden-Powell actually decided on the word Rovers. But in the quote that I've just read to you, it says, or Rovers as they wish to be called. So Rovers were named by themselves. And Ulrich de Berg in 1919, the first ever commissioner for Rover Scouts, he wrote in the Headquarters Gazette, the term Senior Scouts was objected to pretty generally, and it disappeared to be replaced by a senior development of Scout Rovers. There was no more talk of boys or lads, but they were young men. Now, it is fair to say that Baden-Powell at this time, at this very inception, saw the development of Rovers of something like an OTC would be in a public school, an officer training corps. This was where BP envisaged he was going to get his future leaders from. And that was quite a narrow view of what could happen with rovering, as we shall see. And Baden-Powell, like he always did, changed his mind as time went on, and that's all to his credit. Now, these new Rovers, they formed themselves on the same basis as the Senior Scouts were formed in 1917. They were in patrols. They were not in crews. And the person who was in charge of the patrol was called a Rover Mate. And here I'm going to show you the uniform of a 1920 Rover Mate. You can see he has two red stripes. Two red stripes, neckerchief with a knot in it, not a woggle. And there, look, he's got his war service badge on from 1918. And he's got slightly later style of Rover epaulet. So that's the Rover Mate. But if there was more than one patrol, it could be called a Rover Troop. And in that case, you would have a Senior Mate. And he didn't have two stripes, but he had three. So that's the breast pocket of a Rover shirt, 1920, and he's the mate. And there is the early tenderfoot badge. So one of the first ever Senior Scout patrols was at Rowland House under BP Neville, and that very rapidly changed from a Senior Scout patrol to a Rover patrol. And they've got a long history in Rover Scouting, and we should be hearing some more later. Baden-Powell wrote in the Headquarters Gazette that what you should do if you want to set yourself up as a Rover patrol, you need to have a den, he said. A den is absolutely essential because you've got to be away from the younger members. Rover Scouts are men, and Rover Scouts have to be treated as men. And so there's no place for them joining in with Scout meetings except as an instructor or a leader. No, dens in many cases were built by the Rovers themselves. In fact, our RSL there was telling me today that he was responsible for building 3 Rover dens. Now I've been carrying out a census of Rover crews, a database I've been building, and I've logged 3,500 Rover crews so far, and where possible tried to find details of their den, and they are many and various. Here we have a letter written to Baden-Powell by a reply to the letter that Millington wrote. He was a scout master in the Midlands, and he went out to Singapore, and he wrote a letter to Baden-Powell saying that his Rovers young men were forming a Rover crew, they're building a den, and could Baden-Powell please supply a photograph? So Baden-Powell got his coronet up there on paper look from Pax Hill in Bentley, where he lived. He writes, "Dear Millington, I return here with this picture, signed, and with it I send my cordial good wishes for the BP den and the Rover Scouts who infest it." He'd got nothing but a sense of humour. Now, the variety of Rover dens that I've managed to log in my database is absolutely astounding. They met in the crypts of churches, they met in castles, and there is a meeting place here that you're going to see that was built by the Rovers themselves. Now, isn't that unbelievable? That is in the village of Godstone, which is in Sussex, and that was built by the Rover Scouts of Godstone, and they wrote a book about it, and they sold the book to raise the money, and then they also built a pack den for the cubs. So I think that's probably the grandest self-build I've ever seen. If you look on the gate, you can perhaps just discern the Rover Fleur there with "Be Prepared," and if you look underneath the Tudor window, there's the troop badge on the wall. It still exists to this day, and there are still Scouts in Godstone to this day. Now, another Rover crew you can see their den now is a Hertfordshire group, and they leased this beautiful building behind, which was a water tower. Hemel Hempstead District Rover Crew. They look a grand lot, don't they? And they met in that den until about 1936-37, when it was burnt down by vandals. But that's just two examples of a huge variety of dens. So we get to 1922, and something absolutely fundamental to Rover Scouting happened in 1922, and that was BP published his book, Rovering to Success. And here we see the cover of the first edition. Now we can tell it's the first edition because at that time, BP's rank was Sir Robert Baden-Powell Bart, not Lord Baden-Powell of Gilwell. And so that's the first edition. So here we've got the Canadian trapper in his Indian canoe, and he's navigating the rough waters of the river, hoping to get through to the calmer waters and the sunset. And Baden-Powell said that he'd got to navigate the rocks. And the rocks, said Baden-Powell, were horses, wine, women, cuckoos, and irreligion. So this book, written in 1922, was a requirement for all rovers to read before they were initiated into rovers, and it's a requirement today. And of course, the book was written in 1922. There's a lot of things that are out of kilter. 100 years on, that's what you'd expect. But as we said, rovers are men, and we expect men to be able to read and discriminate between that which doesn't apply and the stuff which does apply. And there's a lot in that book that does apply. Rovering to Success announced that there were going to be 2 badges for rovers. And the first of these badges gives some indication as to what the book describes as the philosophy of Rover Scouting, because the first badge was the Rover Instructor, and that is the rover giving service. And the second badge, you can see from these pictures here, they're all the same badge, just different metals being used. And this is the Rover Rambler badge. Now, Baden-Powell was asked his opinion about the second badge, the Rambler badge. And he said, well, for goodness sake, you're supposed to be men. If you think you should have a badge, why don't you just go and pick a bit of bramble out the hedge and stick it in your hat? Wire a bit of bramble into the hat, he said, and your hat band on the left-hand side. Now, for those of you who don't come from the north or from foreign parts, bramble is blackberry. So that's what they did. They stuck a bit of blackberry bramble in their hat band when they'd passed this Rambler badge, which meant that they had to go on a 100-mile hike or a longer bike ride, or they could go on a journey on a canoe, and it had to be logged and written down, and then they could have the Rambler badge. Now, we can see here that, yes, they did listen to Baden-Powell. Yes, they did stick a bramble in their hat, but not for long. The Scout Association found a way of making money by selling these metal badges. And then as those got to be too dear in time, the same design on a cloth badge came into being. Now, in Scouting for Boys, Baden-Powell shows that he's come a long way from his idea that Rover Scouts would just be an officer training corps. And he wrote this. He said, Rover Scouts are a brotherhood of the open air and service. They are hikers on the open road and campers in the woods, able to shift for themselves, but equally ready to be of service. Now, that is the key word. When you entered this waiting room today, you saw the Rover badge with the word service. Service is the thread that binds the whole of rovering together. I'll go so far as to say that if you have a rover that hasn't got a history of service since he's been a rover, or you have a rover crew that hasn't got a program that includes service, then what you've got are imposters and not Rover Scouts, because the entire basis of rovering is built on that one word, which you see, or you would see if I could hold it up on the Thane Rover flag behind me. You see it on Rover badges. It is the raison d'etre of rovering. Now, Baden-Powell was brilliant at dreaming things up, and I've often wondered where he got that concept from, because it's not really that much to the fore in scouting. A scout does a good turn to somebody every day, that's there, but not to the extent that it is in rovering. And I discovered that Baden-Powell had met, and many times he'd met the person who innovated the top H. Tubby Clayton in the First World War was a Padre, and he invented a organization for men. Rovering is an organization for men. In the northeastern town of Popinguet in France, close to the front line, he established a refuge in a house where men could go down if they were lucky enough to get a day's leave. They could go down to that house and be treated to a bit of civilization. Baden-Powell did the self-same thing by initiating the Scouts huts in France, but that's a different story altogether. So why was it called the TOC H? Well, TOC is radio talk in 1916, 1980 for the word T. H is H. TH stands for Talbot House. And there was a Talbot House in Popinguet. And then after the war, there was one near Tower Bridge in London. And after the war, a lot of TOC H organizations, I've logged 25 Rover crews that were hosted by the TOC H. TOC H was the sponsor of 25 Rover crews. But Tubby Clayton had this to say, which I think greatly influenced Baden-Powell. He said, service is the price that we pay for our service on earth. Now that should stop and make you think. That's where I think Baden-Powell got his rationale that service should be central to rovering. So, First World War ended, Rovers came home, the young men came home, they joined the Rover crews, and rovering to success, 1922. The next big milestone marker is 1924, when we had the first Moot in rovering. And this that you can see now is the program cover. And there you see a Rover Scout rolling up his sleeves, looking at the squire, waiting to be initiated. It took Baden-Powell up to this time, 1926, to find a philosophy on which he could hang the basis of Rover Scouting in the same way as he used the Jungle Book, to the stories of Mowgli, to hang the training of wolf cubs on. So the central thing that he used was Arthurian legends. So there we have the Rover Squire waiting for initiation. Easter 1926, it doesn't say it on the program, but it was at the Royal Albert Hall. And that was the first time that ever the Rover initiation was performed. And in the program, that is written out in the back of the program. And the Thane Rover Crew, and I think most of the Rover crews in the world, use very, very close words to the original words that Baden-Powell wrote in 1926 to initiate squires, as we call people awaiting initiation into rovering. Now, all those people that have become rovers will know that this is something that you are never going to forget in your entire life. And in these days, we don't make the ceremony secret, although it was secret just to scouts back in the day. And those people that have observed our initiations that we conduct at Gilwell Park have said just how moving they are. The first thing to recognize is that the squire just doesn't come along and say he wants to be a rover. He has to have read Rovering to Success, and he has to give some close thoughts to what it is that he wants to achieve as a rover. as we know, is got to be ready to perform service. So as in the squires of old, he was called upon to perform a vigil, which back in the day used to be all night in a place of the rover's choosing, a private and quiet place where he would contemplate his life up till that date, and he would think about the changes that would be necessary for him to receive the training and give the service that he needed to give to be able to perform as a rover. So if we just have a look now at the next image, we can see that this Moot, it was called in 1926. Here's a note from Baden-Powell to Neville. Neville was, you recall, the mate, the senior mate of the Rover Patrol, and previous to that, the SS Patrol at Rowland House. Well, now he's Rover Commissioner. So Baden-Powell writes to him, Neville, how about the word moot for a Rover assembly? It's a good old-fashioned English term, and it's still used to this day. A meeting of rovers. Every 4 years, there's a meeting, and it's called a moot. All in different places, like the Olympic Games, every 4 years. So if we get back now to the initiation ceremony, which is so important, it's got different elements to it. We've talked about the vigil. The rover is brought into the meeting by a sponsor who has been looking after him during his initiation. And at the ceremony, the RSL will have to hand a bowl of water and a towel, and the rover's hands are ceremonially washed. And this is washing away everything that he might have done in the past that was not quite toward, looking forward to a brighter future. And the Rover Scout will say, and the page is turned. You turn the page to a new life. And then an important part of the ceremony, which is quite a surprise to a lot of people, is that the Rover Scout leader will turn around and he'll thump the rover hard on his shoulder, either with his fist or with some towel or some bag of sand or something, such that the rover is certainly going to know that it's happening. And this is called the buffet. And the rover leader will say that this buffet is a reminder to you that any imputation against your honor is to be most keenly felt. Now, I want you to hang on to those words, because they will occur later on in the talk. So at the end of the ceremony, the squire is now a rover, is welcomed into the crew, and he receives this certificate. Now, as rovering has gone on, of course, we've had other chief scouts. Other chief scouts have used the same certificate, but they sign themselves at the bottom. There is one signed by Baden-Powell of Gilwell, and the Rover Squire standing before St. George at the round table. Remembering, Rover Scouting is based on Arthurian legends, and the round table is important. It's got the fleur-de-lis on it. And you've got various personages sitting around that table. Okay, so we've got there personage to the left of the Rover Squire, who has in his hand a model of the rocket, and his name is Robert Stevenson. And the reason why he's there was, believe it or not, he was the godfather of Baden-Powell. And then on the right, we've got a gentleman in a bit of armor with red pantaloons. His name is Captain Smith. Now, you might not remember, but Captain Smith married Pocahontas and founded the state of, I've forgotten, one of the East Coast states in America. And all the other people, I think that's Abraham Lincoln behind him. And then I think you've got Scott in his polar gear. All the other people are people that influenced Baden-Powell, or Baden-Powell thought were people from his heritage. his ancestors, as was Smith, Captain Smith or Smythe, who married Pocahontas. So there we are. It's a nice certificate, and then we use that certificate today in the Thane Rover Crew. So Rovers have got the instruction now that they are to be of service, and the way in which they gave service was as individuals, but also as crews. And again, in my compiling of the database, I've come across very, very many different forms of service, all very valuable to the communities. And of course, people who perform service, it's a value to themselves. But Baden-Powell did have these words to say, which are repeated in the initiation ceremony. Service, he said, is not something that you do because it's easy. The definition of service in Baden-Powell's book was service is something that you do that is going to cause you some effort. If it's easy peasy and it doesn't cost anything and it's just something you can give away, you can't call that service. Service, Baden-Powell said, is something that you have to work at. Okay, and all sorts of different forms of service was given. And we're going to look now at one or two different forms of service. Now, here is an ambulance station on the A1 near the South Mims service station, where that is now today. And it's an ambulance service hut that was manned by Rover Scouts every weekend. Admittedly, it wasn't just one crew, it was Hertfordshire Rover Crews. And every weekend in those days, there were accidents, and they were what we would call the first responders today. And there was another such hut by a different Rover crew on the Hog's Back going down to the south coast. This is a form of service. On numerous beaches, there were lifeguard stations and manned by Rover Scouts. And in the Isle of Wight, where it seems to have been a hotbed of roving, I think I've logged 17 different Rover crews in the Isle of Wight. There was a group of Rover Scouts at Freshwater who formed a fire service. And they had this old Victorian horse-drawn fire engine. Now, you might think that looks like a bit of a joke, but it worked in Victorian times, so why shouldn't it work in the 1930s? It just so happens that the nearest big house to Freshwater was the house lived in by Lord Somers, who was to become, after Baden-Powell died in 1941, the next chief scout. But at that time, nobody knew that was going to happen. Well, in his house, there was a fire. And this fire engine, manned by the Freshwater Rovers, were the first on the scene and stopped the house from being burnt down. So very, very grateful council decided that they would buy Freshwater Rover Crew this, a brand new V8 Ford fire engine. And can you see the hats? Now, an amazing thing happened. Every Rover Scout in the fire service had a public telephone installed into their house, connected direct to the fire station. And when there was a fire alert, these alarms rang, and this fire engine with a Rover Scout crew turned out, and this was the community fire service for that part of the Isle of Wight, manned by Rover Scouts. And Rover Scouts on the Isle of Wight had Coast Guard auxiliary stations where they set themselves up under known places where the community would and holidaymakers would go swimming. Countless lives were saved. One particular station had got some cliffs behind it. I don't know if it was near Allen Bay, but that sort of coastline where frequently people were getting themselves into trouble. There were so many cliff rescues by this group that they got awarded a Medal of Merit for every single person in the Rover Crew. First time that had ever happened. So that's just sketching the different sorts of service that were carried on by Rover Scouts in their crews and Rover Scouts individually giving service. And now we come to a very special thing, which I think will blow your mind. It certainly blew mine when I first found out about it. So in 1926, the blood transfusion had only been sketchily introduced. Most people didn't know about it. I think the very first blood transfusion in Britain was in 1922. This man you see who signed this certificate down here at the bottom, P. Oliver, he was not a doctor. He was a civil servant, but he had witnessed somebody's life being saved by a blood transfusion. And he was a Rover Scout leader. So his Rover Scouts set up the first blood transfusion service in London, called the London Blood Transfusion Service, and also the Red Cross Blood Transfusion Service, because of course the National Health Service had yet to be invented. Now, when I first found out about this, I thought that what happened was that these rovers gave blood. There were volunteers and gave blood. As important as that is, in those days, there was an accident. Blood couldn't be stored. So there was an accident, and then a rover would be rung up and go by taxi to a hospital in order to give blood as fast as possible. That's how it worked. So Rover Scouts were the first persons to give blood. And this gave an example to the public that they could do that with no ill effect to themselves. And I think for that reason, the Blood Transfusion Service of Great Britain to this very day is based on volunteers. Not many other countries have volunteer blood transfusion service. And I think we can put that down to Rover Scouts, who in 1926 were the mainstay of the blood transfusion service. They didn't just give blood, they organized the entire thing. They weren't the medics, they didn't take the blood, but they booked the hall, they did the publicity, and they checked the people in as well as giving the blood. And there is one example, and get your head around this, one example of a Rover Scout not just giving blood, but a skin graft. Amazing. So we're now in the 1930s, and we can encounter the most famous Rover Scout perhaps of all time. So it's a bit of a quiz. Whilst we get the next slide on, think about who you think is the most famous Rover Scout of all time. He was a Boy Scout until he was about 12, 13. He went to America. We're told that he was involved in 5 different musicals on Broadway at one time. He returned to Britain and he rejoined Scouting. And we come back to Rowland House, I've mentioned several times. You'll mention where the Bears Rover Crew hung out. And Rowland House had a Christmas pantomime, a tradition of Christmas pantomime. It started the year before Ralph Reeder came back from America. But the next year, he was involved in producing the Rowland House Christmas pantomime, which he did for 3 or 4 years. And then in 1932, we have the first London gang show, except it wasn't called a gang show, it was called a review. The gang's all here, because one of the lads at rehearsal, Baden-Powell, Ralph Reeder said, "Where is everybody?" And the lad said, "The gang's all here, Skip." So that's what he called the review. The next year it was the gang show. But it wasn't produced by Ralph Reeder. Well, of course it was produced by Ralph Reeder, but he didn't say that on the program. What did it say on the program? Produced by a Holborn Rover. And that's what it said until 1939. The 1939 gang show was prepared for in rehearsals, everything sent out and ready to go in the phony war when the government decided that theatres must go back. Ralph Reeder joined the RAF. He was sworn to secrecy by SOE, Secret Operations Executive, and he was ordered to take 12 boys, well, these would be young men of Rover Scout age, 12 young men to France from the London gang show and perform a series of gang shows round northern France. And there he was given the job of reporting on the war readiness of the places that he visited, the morale there too, and also to instruct those people that needed it, the officers on the various bases that he visited in all matters concerning security. Now we know as the war grew on, Ralph Reeder became responsible for the wartime services gang shows. And here's a program for the RAF gang shows. There were 6 touring RAF gang shows. 6. Every post-war person in show business of note was in those gang shows. And I'm not going to go through the list because it's far too long. And so after the war, Ralph went back into producing scout gang shows. And you know as well as I do what was said. Somewhere on this earth, a gang show is running at any time. And I think we've got people listening like Dave Mulberry who will swear testimony to that, who met Ralph, as I'm pleased to say I did myself. Right, so now we go on to 1928 when Baden-Powell received a birthday present. And this birthday present wasn't in the form of a parcel. It was the formation of Deep Sea Scouts. Now, of course, Deep Sea Scouts exist today, but I'm afraid they're much like the rest of scouting, changed drastically. They're no longer a section of the Scout movement per se. They are a Scout active support unit. But in 1928, Deep Sea Scouts. Now, I could think that whilst I was saying these words, some people were scratching their heads and said, but Deep Sea Scouts weren't Rover Scouts. Well, just take a look at the handbook then. What does it say? Deep Sea Rover Scouts. And there underneath is the bracelet. Now, we had a different sort of bracelet for armed forces in Second World War with a fleur de lis, but that's the Deep Sea Scouts bracelet, and that is their badge. What Deep Sea Scouts were instructed to do was to make contacts all over the world, to enable scout training to continue wherever, to enable hikes to be organized in ports of call and on leave. And this last one is the most important, to be of service by instructing scouts at ports of call. And that's just what they did. Okay. So we move on now to the 1930s, and the biggest happening in the 1930s was the economic depression. Lots and lots of people being made unemployed, perhaps a bit like today. And Rover Scouts, again, were in the forefront of trying to be of service to their community. So a scheme was devised in Essex by a lady called Miss Magendis. And she rather romantically lived in a castle. She'd got a withered arm, but she was county commissioner of Essex, and she devised the Mullet training scheme, which to start with was for unemployed rovers who came to Hedingham Castle and were trained in the skills of chauffeuring, butlering, or gardening, because it was thought that those skills would enable people to get jobs. And the records show that it worked. Over 530 people who were unemployed got jobs, and another 500 or so who had the very slowest of the low jobs after attending the Mullet course got a promotion. So these courses spread from Hedingham. Can we just see the picture inside Hedingham Castle? There we are. Now remember that the round table is a part of rovering because it's Arthurian legend. Well, there's the round table in Hedingham Castle. I've been there and I've seen it, and it's all marked out just like you'd expect from the Knights of the Round Table. This is inside the keep, and you've got the flag at the top, and this is the coat of arms of the family that owned Hedingham Castle. And you see the star. Well, in heraldry, the star is called a mullet. So that's where the mullet came from the mullet scheme. And so we see the next picture is going to show us, remember, they're being trained in how to be chauffeurs. And there's a picture of the keep we've just looked inside. So that didn't just stop at Hedingham. There was in South Wales, there was a scheme in South Wales, and another one at Widnes in Lancashire. 10 weekend camps on the trot, each training people who were not scouts or rovers to enable them to have better prospects of getting a job. And then another one in Wales at Fleck Webb. And in fact, the Prince of Wales opened the Fleck Webb training centre. Was the last thing he ever did as King of England, just before he abdicated. So that's a form of service that nobody hears about today, but it was very, very part of the fabric of the country, because the government decided the scheme worked so well that they took it over lock, stock and barrel. They used the Rover trainers and they employed more trainers, and there were training schemes like that all around the country. So now we've got the blood transfusion service I've talked about, and we've got this employment training service, two inputs from Rovering that actually affected the whole of Britain. So now we come to 1931, a bit of good news for a change. The idea, the concept of Rovers meeting at a Moot. We'd had other Moots in Britain, but it was decided to have the world's first international Rover Moot at Switzerland, because we'd got a new international scout centre at Kandersteg. There'd been a railway tunnel built between Switzerland and Italy, and the labourers had to live in this hostel. And when the railway tunnel was built, this hostel came vacant, and it was bought for international scouting. And the president of America Scout Association gave a lot of money and bought all the land roundabout. And so the Kandersteg International Scout Centre is there today. I've been. It's a fantastic place. If you ever get a chance to go, go. So this is 1931, the world's first Rover Moot, and the images of an Edelweiss. How appropriate for Switzerland. It was attended by Baden-Powell and Olave. It was went as honoured guests, and there they are at Kandersteg in front of British Rover Scouts and Rover Scouts from across the world. Now, Baden-Powell wrote this of his visit to Kandersteg, and I think it's one of the most moving things that he ever wrote. From where I sit on the flower-bedecked balcony of the chalet, I can see the flags of some 22 countries and the campfires of some 3,000 young men gathered there. Rover Scouts they are, a brigade, as it were, of stormtroopers of the larger army of over 2 million Boy Scouts. Their arms are alpenstocks. Their discipline is of goodwill from within. Their service consists not so much of fitting themselves for war as in developing the spirit of universal peace, because the Third Reich was starting to be on the march. But Kandersteg itself was an enormous success, and we're going to look now at some of the artifacts from that First World Rover Moot. No, that's not quite right, Ian, but never mind. Those neckerchiefs are from the next Moot. Well, there was a Moot in between, but we come to 1939, and we had a Rover Moot at Monzy in Scotland. And this was only 6 months before the Second World War. So the red neckerchief, I bet you've guessed, is the contingent neckerchief of the English Scouts. And the blue neckerchief is the contingent neckerchief of the Scottish Scouts. And the brown neckerchief with the black edge is the neckerchief of the now famous Rowland House Rover Crew, the Bears. So, it was a great success, was the 1939 Rover Moot, and it was attended by, not by any German Rover Scouts, because there'd been no Scouts in Germany since 1935, because Hitler banned it outright. It was against the law to be a Scout. You could be put in prison or worse for being in Scout uniform. Scout uniforms were confiscated, but there were Rovers there from Austria, which, as you know, is on the borders of Germany. Here is the neckerchief that you could buy at the event, showing Monny Castle. It's spelt Monzy, but it's pronounced Monny. That's the castle, and then we move on to the poster stamp. Now you put poster stamps on letters sent home. They didn't make the postage any cheaper, but just I want you to bear that picture in mind, because that is a picture of a Scottish Rover Scout. Just have a look at what he's wearing on his head, because that will become relevant later on. And then we go on. That's a nice little present to take home. And that badge, that cloth badge, was the badge that everybody who attended the Moot wore on their shirt. That was the Moot badge. Okay. So 6 months later, Britain was at war with Germany. A week or two before that was the Anschluss, where the Germans marched into Austria. They took over the whole of Austria. Those young men, those Austrian young men that attended the Moot just 6 months ago were conscripted, and within weeks they were killing British Rover Scouts, and British Rover Scouts were killing them. Baden-Powell was mortified. The whole thing, he said over and over again, that if Scouts camp together, then they will not fight each other. In that, he was wrong. In 1939, Monzy Rover Moot, he sent a message on a gramophone, a recorded message that was played over the loudspeakers, exhorting everybody there who was attending to go back to their homelands and promote peace. But it wasn't to be. Baden-Powell, of course, by that time had gone to live in Nyeri in Kenya, in Pax 2, and that's where he went there to die, and that's where he died. But he was still influencing what was happening up until 1942. Now, Rover Scouts joined the armed forces. Within a very few months, there were 30,000 Rover Scouts in the armed forces. And one by one, every branch of the British Armed Forces, the most senior commanding officer issued a special order that was written down and sent to all the commanding officers of their particular force. And that order was, Rover Scouts are to be encouraged. Rover Scouts are to be assisted in having a den on the base, the ship, or the airfield. And Rover Scouts must be allowed to attend a Rover meeting in uniform. Now, can you imagine that in war conditions? Can you imagine any other organization you can think of on an army base being allowed to turn up in a uniform that wasn't the army uniform? And then in 1941, we had a Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. And he sent the same message to all of the bases underneath his command, which was all European forces. And this is what it said about Rover Scouts. These men are deadly serious on the real business of training themselves for citizenship and scout mastership. They are committed servicemen until the last shot is fired. Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. Now, of course, Rover Scouts were captured in the same ratio as any other group in the armed forces. And so when they were captured, they were put into prisoner of war camps. I've not got time to go into everything that Rover Scouts did in the Second World War. I've written a book about that, and maybe we can have one of these talks a bit later on specifically about that. But just to say, here is a badge of Stalag 383, the Corps de Leon Rover Crew in Bavaria, and they had a cloth badge and a metal badge. What do you think that metal badge was made of? It was made of the silver wrapping paper to the Red Cross chocolate. They had a very difficult war, did the men in that base, because as the Allies drew nearer, the Romans forced them to march further away from the front, and with some very unpleasant consequences. Theirs is a very interesting story, but we don't have time to go into it. We must move on to the Japanese theatre of war. In 1941, the Germans, in 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, as the world knows. At the same time, virtually within days, they attacked Singapore. And we had no defense. So within 2 days, we were totally overrun. So the Japanese were able to herd up all the service personnel and all of the civilians who had come from Britain, and they put them into Changi jail. Some of you of a certain age might remember the television program that was all about that. Tenko, was it called? Or yes, I think it was. Right, well, there inside, locked up inside, was a certain Padre O'Neill, Reverend Padre O'Neill, and he had been in the First World War. He had been a scout, and he was so sickened by the death of destruction of the First World War that he took holy orders. But then imminently for the Second World War, he joined up and he became a Padre in the Australian forces. So he was herded up and put into Changi jail, where he formed 3 different Rover crews. Reverend Rowan O'Neill. He was a giant of a man, and what he did changed the outcome of the war for all Japanese prisoners of war. Because he said in this hellhole, where the Japanese had got a philosophy, if you didn't work, you didn't get fed. So therefore, if you got dysentery, you're almost certainly going to die because you weren't going to get fed. He said, every Rover Scout will choose a buddy, and the buddy will not be a Rover Scout. And the Rover Scout will look out for his buddy, and the buddy will look out for his Rover Scout, and you will encourage all men in the camp to do the same thing. And what happened was that the Japanese sent prisoners out of Changi, further up country, they called it, to every other Japanese prisoner of war camp, and that system went throughout the whole of the Japanese prisoner of war camps, and it's accredited for saving thousands of men's life. Another thing that he said, which might sound a little bit funny to us today, he said, what I want you Rovers to do as you walk around the camp, he said, I want you to smile, because if you do that, you will get an involuntary reaction back. They can't help themselves. They will smile back, and that will lift the spirits. And what we've got to do is to keep our morale high. He knew, and everybody else in that hellhole knew, that we were going to win the war. Don't ask me how they knew that, but that's what they decided was going to happen. They did jobs that no other people would do. They made boilers fed with bamboo and washed the dysentery sheets of the dying. They logged the places where British soldiers were murdered and buried where they fell, so that their bodies could be recovered after the war. So 3 Rover crews were formed in Changi, and I went to research these at Gilwell Park, where their logbooks are kept. And a bit later on, I was able to find out that one of the Rover crew leaders was still alive and living in Luton near Bedford. And I went down to meet him, and his name was Alec. And I knew I was on a winner when I spoke to his son on the telephone, and his son told me that his name was Rowan. Now remember, the inspirational leader at Changi was Reverend Rowan O'Neill, and I discovered that there was more than one Rowan. Several people at Changi had named their sons Rowan. But anyway, we're talking about Alec, the father, and I went to see him, and I spent a very momentous, one of the most unforgettable things that happened to me in my life, listening to his stories about what happened at Changi. And I haven't got time to tell you them all, so I'm just going to pick on one. And if I get a little bit emotional, then that will be par for the course, because I've never told this story without getting emotional. And that is that it came to be, yes, here we've got the neckerchief made from army shirts, and that has got the Japanese letter P on it, so that the Rover Scouts, who could be in big trouble if they were caught meeting more than 3, when the guards asked them what was that, they said it's the Japanese letter P for prisoner. And the previous image was the wristband, and that was a piece of aluminium that had been scratched out into the shape of the fleur-de-lis with a broken dental drill, coloured green by applying aquaflavin ointment. Every member of the 3 Changi Rover crews had one of those things. So I am sitting in Alex's house, and it's 4:30 on a Sunday afternoon, and it's my time nearly to go. And he turned to me and he said, Colin, he said, the biggest upset of my life was that nobody knew when the Japanese war was going to end, because it ended by H-bombs, and nobody knew that that was going to happen. And it just so happened that I was out of Changi on fatigues working in paddy fields when the atomic bombs were set up. The Japanese surrendered within 3 days. Almost immediately, the Allies arranged for the people who were in Changi jail to be shipped out. Well, Alex wasn't there. Alex was on fatigues in the fields. So he said to me, the biggest upset in my life, Colin, was that I wasn't able to say goodbye to my boys. So I fished out of my briefcase the photocopied logbook of the Rover Crew that Alex Brown ran. And on the last page was an entry he'd never seen because he wasn't there. He was out on fatigues. And it said, this is the last entry of the first Changi Rover Crew. It's great regret that we leave this place without being able to say goodbye to our inspirational leader, Alex. His boys were speaking to him from decades and 12,000 miles. He was in tears. I was in tears. I'm not ashamed to say it. It was very, very emotional. And then time came to go home, but Alex died a year later. So we're talking about unbelievable bravery shown. We haven't got, I said I've written a book about scouting in the Second World War. You have to read that book, and perhaps we can have another one of these talks. So you've listened to me talk very briefly about German prisoner of war camp, Japanese prisoner of war camp. You won't be expecting to hear about British prisoner of war camps with Rover Scouts as prisoners. I found something on the internet that was the accession log to the Holocaust musician in London. And I looked down the list of things that they'd got, and it said they'd got the logbook of a Rover crew called the Dunham era Rover Crew. So I set about finding out about it. In 1936-37, there were a lot of German and Austrian refugees came to Britain to escape Nazism. Fine, they were accepted into our community. Those families that had got kids who had been scouts before, their kids joined scout troops. And if they weren't in scouts before, well, what a way of integrating into a community than to send your kids to scouts. Swimmingly, fine. Everything in the garden, lovely. 1939 war was declared. These families were rounded up as aliens, and they were sent to internment camps in Blackpool and the Isle of Man. And that's where some of them stayed for the entire war. The government decided that the young men would be better off out of the way. So they arranged to have them shipped to Canada and to Australia. I know nothing about what happened to the ones that were sent to Canada. The ones that were sent to Australia were sent there in a ship called the Dunham. This was a pleasure cruiser designed to take about 135 passengers. It now had 1,650 passengers. It had a crew formed from the Pioneer Corps. The Pioneer Corps were people who had previously been prisoners who were released on promising to serve His Majesty. So they got their freedom by agreeing to serve in the armed forces. These young men on this ship were all Jewish. So a scout troop was formed at the front of the ship, and a Rover Crew was formed at the back of the ship. They called the Rover Crew the Dunham Rover Crew because that was the name of the ship. After the war, the crew of this ship were put on trial as war prisoners because the way they treated these young men. All their worldly goods contained in their cardboard suitcases were meant to be put into the hold for safekeeping. Everything was stolen out of them, and the suitcases were thrown overboard. Some of the guards thought it was a good idea to put down broken glass between the dormitories where the hammocks were hung and the heads, which were the toilets. One person was bayoneted trying to get to the toilet because he was trying to get to the toilet out of curfew hours. That's how they were treated. When they eventually arrived in Australia, the Dunham Rover Crew determined that they would stick together as much as able. They were sent to the Hay Rover internment camp, which the Australians built as a prisoner of war camp, because that's what the British told them was coming, prisoners of war. So it was behind barbed wire on the edge of a desert with gun turrets on each corner, but it was an internment camp. So there they called themselves the Dunham era, the name of the ship with the town of Hay. And there is the front cover of their logbook. I was enabled to read the logbook, but I had to promise on my life that I would not copy it and I would not photograph it. And it was the property of the Holocaust Museum. Well, that the front of it's not it, is it? So there is the photograph proving that they existed. And you'll see it's called an aliens internment camp, but it was built as a prisoner of war. Because of the rules of the Geneva Convention, it had to be inspected by the Red Cross. One of the members of the inspecting team was a district commissioner, a Reverend Twig, from a place called Riverina in that part of the world. So he went to inspect it, and he was absolutely staggered to find that there was a rover crew inside the camp. So he heard the story, and he and other people petitioned the British government that something was not right here. These young men were no threat to anybody in Australia. There was absolutely no reason why they should be locked up. The British government sent a senior officer who was Jewish to Australia, and these young men, not just the rover crew, of course, they were let out. Half of them stayed in Australia and joined the 2nd Shepparton Rover Crew. Half of them, despite the way they'd been treated, opted to come back to Britain to fight the war against the Nazis. Now, it's generally acknowledged in Australia that the influx of talent from the Dunham ship was the biggest influx that Australia had ever had. The lot that came back to Britain, one of them became a lord who was in the House of Lords until he died quite recently. So again, much bravery shown and perseverance and what these young men had to put up with in the name. I don't know what I'm going to call it. It's just absolutely amazing, the inhumanity of mankind to man, isn't it? Okay, so now we are just need to mention perhaps the most famous serviceman of the Second World War. Any bets on what that person might be called? Guy Gibson VC was a Rover Scout. He was invested at a place in Kent called Toville, and he happened just by pure chance, he happened to be billeted on a person called Glad Binsham, who was a senior person employed at Imperial Scout headquarters. Glad Binsham was a breeder of black Labradors. Can you see where I'm going? He gave Guy Gibson a puppy. This puppy, Guy Gibson called Nigger. The day before Guy Gibson was due to go to the Mona Dam on the raid, somebody ran over Nigger. And so Guy Gibson arranged that Nigger would be buried at the moment that his aeroplane was over the Mona Dam. The signal to be sent back to the British base if the raid was successful was the Morse code for Nigger. I'm not supposed to use that word now, am I? But there you are. You can't alter history. So just to say that when Guy Gibson returned, he became the commissioner for Air Scouts in this country. And very, very sadly, he was shot down on his way back from Germany. And the terrible thing that we now know to be true, he was shot down by a British rear gunner, because this plane that Guy Gibson was in took station behind the bomber to defend it. And the rear gunner looked up and saw this shape that looked like an ME-102. Split-second decision, bang, 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 bang. And that's how Guy Gibson died. So we are now at the end of the war and the Rovers return. And I am very much of that era. I was born between VE Day and VJ Day in 1945. We were the baby boomers. So the world was going to change. When Baden-Powell died, Lord Somers became new chief scout. And in 1941, he said, we've got to have a post-war plan. And here it is published in 1946. And this is the bit of the plan for Rover Scouts. And it wasn't really good news, because it said that Rover Scouting could only continue to 27. And then in 2 years later, in 1947, the government decided that national service would be introduced, compulsory for all those between after the age of 18, unless they were in some sort of university or something where it could be deferred. So the bottom end of rovering was taken away and the top end of rovering was taken away. And then as time went on, there were different reports that lowered the age lower and lower until a new rover commissioner was introduced, and his name was David Lumgair, who had been a Rover Scout, and he'd been in the services. He was a group captain, and he returned as Rover Commissioner. And he said that Rover Scouts, the age must be lowered to 23 to force them to become leaders within the Scout movement. Now, to put HQ's side of the story, every school that I went to had to be rebuilt because they weren't big enough, right through my academic career, right through to university. Every cub pack in the 1950s had a waiting list of 2 times. You could have formed 3 cub packs for every cub pack that there was. When those cubs got to be scout age, it was the same story. There weren't enough leaders. So you can see what headquarters were trying to do in trying to encourage its rovers to take on the responsibility of actually running a cub pack or scout group. So every reform, and there was lots of them, more and more impinged on rovers becoming trained for leadership, whether they wanted it or not, in the cub packs and scout groups. And it came to a head with David Lumgair. And he wrote this in the Scout magazine. So I am only quoting what is in the Scouting publication. And he's talking about the problems that he'd got with Rover Scouts. This is what he was doing, why he was doing, and this is why they would eventually be abolished. He said, the trouble began when rovers who had reached that stage in their lives, when they should have taken out leadership warrants, were faced with the wrench of saying goodbye to rovering. But, he said, they did not have the guts to do so. Now, he is talking to Alec Brown of the Changi Rover Crew. He's talking to those Jewish lads. He's talking to all of those rovers who gave service in all the forms that I've told you about, who did so much good for their community. And here is somebody saying they hadn't got the goods. Now, remember the rover initiation ceremony? What did Baden-Powell said? There is nothing so great as an imputation against your honor. Do you think that was an imputation against these men's honor? A lot of them resigned. Some left the Scout Association and formed other associations because they wanted to stay rovers. Rover promise is one that you make for life. The RSL does not say, I'm making you a rover until such time as the Scout Association want to abolish it. You become a rover for life. You take that promise, and that promise is binding. All over the world, there are people listening to me now nodding, who are listening in this audience, who are rover scouting in South America, which is one of the biggest reservoirs of rover scouting in the world, but there are rover scouts in Australia and in Canada and in most of the countries in the world. The only place where there aren't Rover Scouts within the Scout Association is in the UK. But there are independent Scout associations in the UK, the Baden-Powell Association, the European Federation of Scouts who have Rover Scouts. And there are many other crews now, like the Thane Rover Crew. We are all members, all our local members are members of the Scout Association. But we are lifetime rovers. We made the promise and we live roving. Now, in 1957, just before the advance report, we had a World Jamboree, the biggest World Jamboree because Britain founded scouting, and the name of the World Jamboree was JIM, and JIM stands for Jamboree. We know what that means. Indaba, that was an African word purloined by Baden-Powell because it was the word for a meeting place of chiefs, because there was a conference at every World Jamboree. And then the last word is Moot. So the last fling of Rover Scouting really was at the World Moot in 1957. But at that time, there was a moot in the southeast counties of England, and David Lungar had done his work and introduced the lower age group to 23 and announced that rovering would be abolished. And so, as a protest, this device was built. Rover Scouting are the words on the coffin. There was more than one coffin in more than one moot. The bigwigs were having a conference inside a marquee. 6 burly rovers put the coffin on their shoulders, carried it around the site, went through into the conference marquee, walked up the middle aisle, put it on the desk in front of the bigwigs, and walked out again without saying a word. But Rover Scouting was dead. 1967, the Advance Party reform, it was dead. It was dead in the Scout Association in Britain. But Rover Scouting survives all over the world and in the independent crews and some independent organizations in Britain. So the last thing that we're going to do is look at the Rover Way. 100 years of rovering. Now, you might think this is quite strange, but this is a badge sold by the Scout Association to celebrate 100 years of rovering in 1918. And there at the top is the UK Scout contingent, because we don't have Rover Scouts to send. So in 1990, the British Scout Association, of which we are loyal members, petitioned the World Scout Organization to change the name of Rover Moot to Scout Moot. So we don't have Rover Moots anymore. The Moot, called Rover Way in Holland in 2018, was for British explorers and network. So there we are. We're 100 years of roving and gone right back to the start in 1900. I do hope that you've enjoyed this talk, and I have to say, without Chris and Ian, who have assisted me so wonderfully as technicians and picture editors and organizers, this couldn't have taken place. So if you're going to give a clap, we won't hear it, but I'll see you doing it. Thank you very much. You've been a very good audience. I've never had such a quiet audience in my life.
Thank you. I'm just going to hand you over to John Granger to say a few words from the North Riding Rover Crew. So I'm going to hand you over now. Fingers crossed.
Thanks, Chris. Hope you can all hear. Well, service, which we've heard quite a lot about tonight. Not a word that's particularly fashionable these days in a world that increasingly seems to be self-centered and where looking after number one is the prevailing philosophy. But in this brilliant talk we've just heard, Colin has reminded us that it's not only our duty to give service as Rover Scouts, but it gives us a reward as well, the knowledge that we're helping other people. And of course, that duty, as he also reminded us, comes at a personal cost. Without a cost to ourselves, that's not really service, truly. Now, it's over half a century ago that the Scout Association in the UK finally killed off rovering, or again, as we heard, in fact, that started a little bit before then in the mid-1940s, just after the Second World War. And really, it sort of abandoned the idea that the game of scouting, as the founder often called it, could be enjoyed by adults as much as it could by by young people. And it was as only if they could take a commitment, as we've heard as leaders, could they carry on. And of course, not everybody can give that commitment. Even if we all give service, we can't all give up that amount of time that those of us who are also leaders in youth sections know is all time consuming as well. So that would seem to me, and I know to Colin and to all of us here, was a huge loss, actually, particularly in the UK, to scouting, to young people, and to others who are adults who want to enjoy that whole experience, the fellowship of the open air, as the founder called it, and could have given more service. But what actually happened? Well, in fact, despite those 50 years or more since we saw those coffins being offered around, there's been a fantastic revival and interest in Rover Scouting, and all of us sitting on the screen on this meeting tonight are all testament to that, because all of us, even the oldest of us here, are really pretty much, post that mid-1960s watershed when rovering disappeared. So particularly as Colin said, in certainly most of the Latin American countries, rovering's been strong all the way through. In a lot of Europe, particularly Southern Europe, in Spain, Italy, that is the case. But in the UK and the United States in particular, and Canada over the last few years, certainly in this 21st century, we've seen a huge growth of rovering. And what's quite interesting is that a lot of those people are a whole younger generation. With all due respect to Colin and myself, I draw a state pension now as well. It's a younger cohort of people who have come into rovering. And a lot of them are actually simultaneously leaders of Scout Association youth groups as well. Not all, but quite a few are. And I think that's a wonderful endorsement of what rovering's all about, because those people in particular are seeking a different experience, but a complementary experience to the scouting they have with their youth sections. So that is tremendous. And all of those people, they've embraced the whole ethos of traditional rovering, with everything from the program to our investiture ceremony, which is so important. The whole idea of the vigil, which when I did it 5 years ago, was a fantastic watershed moment for me. And I know those of you who've done that would feel the same. So they embraced all of those things, even our wonderful iconic uniform, which strangely is still more recognizable 50 years on than the modern version that passes as uniform today, but I'm not going to go there. Finally, well, I think my real takeaway from this is really back to Colin himself, because I've heard Colin speak quite a few times actually, and read some of his books, but every time I listen to Colin, I learn something new. And I have got a pad of things I've been writing down during this meeting, which are things I didn't know about before. I mean, I really didn't. I've done a little bit of work on this. I'm nowhere near what he knows about it. And like all good historians, what I've noted when I've met Colin as well, I met him at home, is that he's got this inquiring mind. He's asking as many questions as he's answering for you. And that's what I think is really amazing, that thirst for knowledge, which he then, he can share that with us, and he does it so enthusiastically, which I think you'd all agree, very generously as well. Well, that's it. I think I'm sure you'll agree that we've been treated to an amazing talk, learnt a huge amount. Colin, thank you on behalf of us all for enlightening us, entertaining us, and encouraging us in our journey as Rover Scouts. So I invite you all, even though Colin may not be able to hear us because of the muting, to show your appreciation in the usual way.
Well, thank you very, very much. I can see that a lot of questions have been lodged, and lots of people have written some very nice things, which I'll read later. And I can see it's very nice to see contributions here from people from all over the world, which is really good. But I have a question here from Don, and Don wants to know. He says, "I understand that you belong to an independent rover crew, and I understand that you are a member of the Scout Association. Don wants to know if there's any conflict between the two things, because I think you're right, Don. In the past, no doubt, there was some aggravation. I'm not saying that it was all one-sided, because it certainly wasn't, between rover crews and the Scout Association. But now, the Thane Rover Crew, the word Thane means independent. Yet the founder members of the Thane Rover Crew, 3 of us, have between us 160 years service as warranted leaders within the Scout Association. We, the Thane Rover Crew, are the service team to Gilwell Park, and some of you will have seen the virtual tour of Gilwell Park produced for the virtual Gilwell reunion in September. And that tour is me going around Gilwell Park and pointing out all the things the Thane Rover Crew have done for our service in Gilwell Park. I think it's fair to say there isn't a wooden structure that's connected with the history of scouting, building or gateway, that we haven't either renovated or totally rebuilt. And the powers that be at Gilwell Park and in the Scout Association know the members of the Thane Rover Crew. We have never hidden from them that we are members of the Thane Rover Crew and that we are the Gilwell service team. We are also within our own communities. I am the manager of Pontefract and Castleford Scout Active Support. Ken, our RSL, is the president of Pontefract and Castleford Scout Association. So we see no conflict whatsoever. Rovering as it was meant to be